So I'm Robin Truslow. I'm Public Relations Coordinator for Calvert Library. And so one of the hats I wear is adult programming. And we always like to have a good African American History Month program. And this year I had a lot of help pulling this one together. And Michael and Donald, and we had these conversations, and I said, okay, what can we do good? And I can't even tell you, I'm so excited about this because Donald told us about Tina and about this cool documentary that's coming out sometime this spring on National Geographic that Tina and Donald are in. So you'll hopefully hear a little more about that. But for now, I'm going to start with our moderator and let her introduce who else we have at the table. So Kirsty Umala is our moderator tonight. She is retired county archaeologist and historic preservation planner. She was the historic preservation planner and county archaeologist for Calvert County for more than 27 years. She now conducts historical research, principally about local African American communities for projects that may include interpretation of historic contexts, engagement with descendant communities, and more. Kirsty's work is rooted in the belief that the past can be a powerful tool for building better and more just communities in the present. And I am looking forward to a conversation today that will lead us down that path and learning more about our African American history locally and how that ties to our present and can improve our future. So I turn it over to Kirsty.
Well, thank you. I'm really pleased to have a front row seat to this conversation and was delighted to be invited to moderate it. The speakers in order that you're going to hear them tonight for their brief presentations before we open it for conversation and questions from the audience are to my left, Michael Gayhart-Kent, who is a local historian, author, and present everywhere. It seems he is also the chair of the Calvert chapter of the NAACP. His most recent book is Mulatto, The Black History of Calvert County, Maryland, a book that relates the history of people of color in Calvert County and includes a chapter on 21 Black Calvert County veterans, one of whom is among us today, a member of the 82nd Airborne, Angus Gray. The book is available from the library and for sale at the Calvert County Historical Society, Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum, and on Amazon. Mr. Kent will talk about Reverend Arthur Jones' father and grandfather who served in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. And this should be of special interest to members of the Jones, Brown, and Gant families of Calvert. He'll also share how military service influenced African Americans to join the merchant service. Next to Mr. Kent is Tina Marie Dunkley, who is an artist, a multimedia artist and author. Presently, she is co-curating an archival exhibition that includes Georgia artist and authors Benny Andrews, Flannery O'Connor, and Alice Walker at the Rose Library at Emory University. Additionally, she's preparing to publish the second edition of The Americans, Forgotten Freedom Fighters in the War of 1812, a coffee table volume for middle and secondary levels. This lost chapter of world history conveys the uncanny discovery of her ancestor joining hundreds of enslaved freedom seekers that sided and aided the British in the role of colonial Marines in the War of 1812. At the end of the war in 1815 and 1816, each decommissioned Marine was granted land in Trinidad, Tobago, and what's known as the Company Villages, a thriving Maroonage community of descendants called Americans was established. She will discuss her serendipitous, unscripted journey to making that discovery. And for more information, about the Americans, watch the documentary, which Robin alluded to. Finally, at the end of the room is local historian, author, marine archaeologist, and prolific award-winning author, Donald Chomet. Soon, Ms. Dunkley and Mr. Chomet will be featured in that National Geographic documentary about Barney's flotilla and the African-American experience in the War of 1812. Mr. Chomet's books are available to check out from the library and on Amazon. And if you're interested in the War of 1812, particularly take a look at Flotilla, the Texan naval campaign in the War of 1812. Now with that, each of our presenters is going to have 10 to 12 minutes to present to you, and then we're going to open the floor for questions and discussion. And you're
Starting with me.
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. I apologize for not standing up, but the microphone is down here on the table. They're starting with me because we're talking about choices that enslaved people made to go into the military, to do other things. What got me started doing research about my family is that they've been here since at least 1780. I have documentation on that because they were owned by the Kent family in Lower Marlborough. And Joseph Kent from that family later became the governor of Maryland. So his records were preserved in the archives in Annapolis and not burned in the courthouse. So I'll have a little more detail than other people do. When you start researching enslavement in Calvert County, the first place you need to go is the book written by Charles Ball, The Life of a Slave. Charles Ball was around during that time as my family was. And the first memory Charles Ball had was of being about 4 years old and being pulled away from his mother by someone and watching his mother being hit by someone else to make them let him go to that person. So that was pretty common at that time to do the family separations, and you don't know where your child, brother, uncle, father might be taken. That was the whole thrust of why my family didn't leave when the British came through, is because they knew that whichever family member was taken away from them knew where they were. They'd have no way of finding out where people that were taken away were sent to. So if they left with the British or ran away at that time, they would be giving up any hopes of finding family members. They also knew, having been there several generations by that time, by the War of 1812, probably at least 2, maybe 3 generations, there were other ways out of slavery. You could buy your way out of slavery by working on other farms, other plantations, but something pretty common was that you could age out of slavery. Those of you that had the good luck of ever working tobacco know what backbreaking work that is today. Imagine that back in the 1800s when there was no machinery whatsoever. You were doing everything by hand, clearing the field, all the planting, all the watering. So by the time they were 40 years old, that owner, whoever owned the enslaved person, wasn't getting as much for his bucks as he was when the person was much younger. So it was a lot of times it was easier, cheaper just to let them go, give them their freedom rather than continue to pay for their food, clothing, and what simple housing they had, just to give them your freedom. So they could see a path to freedom without necessarily running away. Now, what was going on was not easy to live with. There was a lot of hardships, of course, during the enslavement, not only the cruel treatment by different masters and overseers, but also people call tobacco the money crop, but actually slavery was the money crop. You could never be sure of a good crop any particular year. You don't know that drought might happen, or you might get too much rain so that you couldn't make any money that year. Everything may burn up in the field. The one thing they were sure of, they could always sell a slave. So slave breeding became common in some states, Maryland, Virginia, especially when the international slave trade was stopped in 1800. You could always make additional money by selling slaves farther south because you always needed more workers down in the south with the cotton. Okay, so with that in mind, it became really intolerable for some people to stay in enslavement. Those are the people that said, I've got to make this choice to find something else other than being in this enslaved position. So one group, but some people like Charles Ball, he did join the Americans. After he ran away and then he came back a few years later to Calvert County, he joined the Americans in their battle against the British. Even though he fought heroically, not just bravely or whatever, but heroically. After he completed his service, he was still considered a slave and he was sent back to Georgia. So he didn't get any reward from that whatsoever. We also had some people who joined the British. They were colonial Marines. They ended up at the end of the war going back with the British to Florida. That's where the British had their ammo and everything, their stockpiles of ammunition, because it was closer to go down to Florida to a fort there than to go back to Great Britain. Florida at that time was still owned by Spain. So the United States couldn't do anything about them being there. So the colonial Marines ended up going back to Florida. Eventually the British left there as well, but they left them the fort. And the colonial Marines and the Native Americans, the Seminoles and the Choctaw, inhabited that fort for several years, and it became known as Negro Fort. Now, Negro Fort, again, the United States, particularly Andrew Jackson, who was the #1 general at that time, didn't like them being there. He sent a gunboat down to intimidate them off of the river Pensacola. He fired a warning shot to warn them, that you guys need to get out of here. That one warning shot happened to hit the ammunition that had been stored there for years and years. The entire fort blew up with one shot. There were 300 people inside the fort at the time, with another 1,500 or so outside. Almost everyone inside the fort was killed immediately. People outside the fort decided to scatter, which made sense. Those that managed to survive, the British were allied with the Creek Indians at that time. The Choctaw and the Seminoles were working with the Americans. So the British allowed the Creeks to go in and scalp survivors. So that was the intimidation to make sure that this never happened again, that the entire fort and the community was destroyed. You also had some people that semi-worked with the United States as privateers, basically private pirates, where they worked aboard ship to scuttle British ships and steal their cargo and turn the booty over to the Americans. One of the most famous of those was a guy named Richard Crayfus, who lived he was enslaved over on the eastern shore of Maryland, but he was captured along with a lot of other black merchant seamen. They were taken back to Dartmoor prison in England. And it was kind of like a Hogan's Heroes thing there, where you managed yourself inside that prison. All they did was give you your food and your water, clothing, but you took care of the discipline yourself inside of the fort. Well, it wasn't actually a fort, it was just a compound. Richard Crayfus, being a very tall man, he was described in letters as being over 7 feet tall. He was probably about 6'4" or 6'5", because the average height of men back then was about 5'3" or 5'4". So he looked like he was 7 feet. But he was in charge because he was the biggest person. Didn't matter what color you were. They had other Europeans there, but he was in charge of everything. At the end of the war, when they were ready for them to, according to the treaty, to be taken back to the United States, he refused to go. And he was so big, the British were afraid to make him go. So they had to negotiate for about 6 months in order to get them to leave prison, because they felt that prison was better than being enslaved in the United States. So eventually they were able to negotiate where they would come back to a northern part of the United States and not to a southern area. Now, all this experience at sea with the British and with the privateers, you had at the end of the War of 1812, this lull between 1812 and the Civil War, where a lot of blacks became merchant seamen. Particularly from Calvert County, you'll see in the census records, a lot of captains and seamen that are listed in the census reports. That's because even if you were a free person of color, you were never free. If you were on land, you had to have a pass with you. Even if you were free, you had to be able to show that you were free and you could go someplace without being taken back into slavery. And some people, even that were free, as you saw in the film 12 Years a Slave, were kidnapped back into slavery, even though they were free. But if you were aboard ship, they couldn't get access to you. Young white men, young white boys, I'd say, had lots of opportunities off the ship. So they weren't crazy about the hard work on the ships and the amount of time you're out at sea without seeing anyone. This was better, again, than slavery for black males. And when you were aboard ship, you had to get along with everybody, regardless of color. You ate together, slept together, played together. And again, at times, these ships would go into other countries. Still, they would come back to Maryland. That was a question I had too. Why? Because it'd say, well, my family is still back in Maryland, still back in slavery. And so they would still return regardless. But it was a better job, better opportunity for them to stay aboard that ship. And they did pay very well aboard merchant ships. And during that time between 1812 and the Civil War, 1865, about 40% of the crew members were of African descent. Even after the war were over and after the Civil War, if you look in the census records, you'll find a number of seamen and sailors in the census records in the 1880s and on. And some of these things I found by going through obituaries from Baltimore. Could find people, for example, as Kirsty had said, Arthur Arthur Jones from Calvert County. He was born 1842, died in 1904, but his father, it's an obituary, his father came from the west coast of Africa and fought in the Revolutionary War. And his father fought in the War of 1812. But again, he left, so he didn't pass that legacy along, but his family was still here in Calvert County. There's also a Thomas Brown, who was born in 1818. He died in 1913. He was also listed as a ship's captain for many years on a ship called the Henry Clay and the Carswell here in Calvert County. And the thing that really surprised me, there was a man named George Bowen. He also was born in Calvert County in 1848. And his father was a ship's captain during slavery. And he said his father was still enslaved, but he still was able to captain a ship, a schooner that went back and forth from Calvert County to Baltimore. So obviously his owner was collecting money for that, but still they had the skills and the ability to do it. And I guess the trust to go back and forth with these merchant ships. Now, most people think of the Underground Railroad as being this secret organization of moving from place to place. A large part of the Underground Railroad were these merchant seamen because they knew the landscape. And the people that would come on and off the ship to load and unload were other enslaved people. They would pass information along to them about this is where you need to go up the river here, we're up the bay here to find help, or this is the terrain you will find. Okay, so they were also a big part of the Underground Railroad. I think I'm about 10 minutes, right?
You're perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be that back.
Okay. Maybe just. Okay. And good evening. Welcome, everyone. First, I have notes I have to read from this. I'm not. You obviously have been speaking about this on a more frequent basis than I have. It was wonderful. But first, I would like to thank Robin Thorslow and the Calvert County Library Administration for organizing this event. And a special note of appreciation for the inimitable Dawn Shumet for suggesting my invitation, this inclusion. This occasion really feels providential, given the struggles America's having with our education system, preferring instead to deal with some of the consequences of instead of the truth. But this evening, we are discussing major historic events that preceded the births of activism and the activism of Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and John Brown, and hopefully encourage the audience within and without to look forward to their elders and ancestors to raise significant questions. As I reflect on how I exactly arrived at this moment and at this location with these esteemed panel members, it directly relates to the absence of information in the curriculum of my K through 12 years in which I was bored to ad nauseum, listening to the history that excluded African Americans. The tedium of the dates and events that we were required to regurgitate on exams left me with a contempt for the subject of, quote, American history. But fast forward, now we have Black History Month, which for me in a way misses the point, a kind of misnomer. But by the same token, it has moved me into an adulthood to know more, to essentially I ended up enrolling in an African and African American Studies program at the storied Atlanta University back in the 70s. At any rate, the absence of this knowledge precipitously changed once my brother and I started asking simple questions about our elder Aunt Elaine Williams Jones. She was the third eldest of 8 siblings, and she held the thread of information about the surnames and unusual history of our family from Trinidad. The information that my brother Ken recorded in 1974 unwittingly led us in 2008 to the discovery of our family's role in the center of the War of 1812. So this evening, I will give a brief overview of how my family came to discover our 4th level grandparents, how they were successful in their quest for freedom. And I hope to shed some light as to, I hope to shed light on just how much more there is to know about Africans in the American experiment. And actually, I was going to mention the Negro Fort in Florida, as Mr. Ken has just given us a background of, so I won't go into that. I'm going to go ahead and start with what I have set up in the visual sense, because I am a visual artist. And the first 2 images that you're seeing here are from an exhibition. Once I made this discovery, I produced artwork that tied to the information that I got. And the first piece, Lunar Eclipse, has to do with Ezekiel Loney, who was the ancestor. Ezekiel Loney and Nellie Loney are my 4th grade grandparents that made that journey. So those are the 2 works that sort of set that up. And the other one is a flag that I did. It's based on Shanklin Bartlett's declaration. This was another enslaved person who ran off with the British and sent a letter back to his owner to let him know that he was doing quite well. And you can read that online. I have it embedded here, but I know I have to move fairly rapidly. So I just want to go through this fairly quickly. This is the aunt, Elaine Williams Jones, who we recorded. She was very clear, because my grandparents did come into this country with all 8 children between 1918 and 24. So they immigrated to New York City in that period of time. And my brother, Ken Dunkley, had the notion to record my aunt, because she knew all of the names, the older names of the family. We have the Williams, Herberts, and the Loneys. And she knew her great uncle's names. And so this information we were sitting on. And we were sitting on this information. And by the way, my brother, who's this image that you see here, the red image in the center is a hologram. So he's a holographer, a renowned holographer. And this particular hologram is called Thoughts, and it ripples out. But the whole idea to this was that he had a thought, we had a thought, and it rippled out into the discovery that we would make. So right after my mother's generation passed, this is my mother and her brother, Alfred Williams, I went back to Trinidad, and this is my mother, Margaret Williams Dunkley, Alfred Williams, her brother. I went back to Trinidad and went looking for Loney. The name was Loney, and I found a cousin, Roderick Loney. Are we changing? I'm sorry.
I'm on the Alfred Williams.
Okay, I'm forgetting that I'm not telling you to change.
This is where we should.
Okay.
Roderick Loney.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Roderick Loney, rest his soul, he just recently passed, I understand, was a cousin. I reached out through the directory, telephone directory, and found him. And he was telling me who I needed to see, which was Augustus Lewis. These were people, the Americans, as it were, who the descendants of the people that ran off with the British. And so he was the one that led me to this information. And in turn, the name that next slide, we got it. In turn, I discovered on this trip to Trinidad in a book, you see it highlighted here, Ezekiel it says Ellen there, but it's Nellie Loney. The name Bukusu, if you see that name Bukusu, well, this was the name that my aunt spoke about all through my life. And I think I asked every person that I ever met from the continent of Africa if they had ever heard of the name Bukusu and what did it mean. So, and that started in childhood. So I never dreamed that I would see this name in print, but it would be the linchpin that would totally connect the family in my understanding that journey. So from there, this was a reunion of a group of the descendants of the Americans that ran off with the British. So that's how I found this particular brochure in a bookstore. So then the next move was I ran into this, I'm gonna back up, I'm sorry.
John McNish.
Yeah, John McNish, and go to the next slide. Because John McNish published this book, The Americans, Free Black American Settlers in Trinidad. That's the book that I discovered in the archives. And once I read that book, because he laid out all of the names of every single person that the British received from the shores in the Chesapeake Bay and beyond, Cumberland Island and some in the Gulf. Once I saw that, I decided that I had to meet him. So I'm going to go back one slide. I went to England because he told me, really after I introduced myself, he says, oh my God, he says, I think I know your ancestor, so well, Ezekiel Loney. And he showed me his name in all of these musters. I couldn't believe his name just, along with Nellie and their children. I think I've entered the next one because we talked about this proclamation. I'm going to show the proclamation where the British are actually offering the freedom to those African Americans who would choose, the enslaved African Americans who would choose to actually go with them. And this is that document that I've sort of enhanced, but it clearly says that, and I quote, well, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because we know I'm short on time, but essentially what it says is that they're offering freedom in some of their other colonies. So essentially, along the way, I've since then found, so I've gone to several other places, but there's a load of information in so many places like the University of Virginia. This is the letter that describes their actual escape of Ezekiel Loney, Tom Saunders, who was his brother-in-law, and Kennedy Breton. And this is the letter, this is the transcription that you're looking at. And then next to that, I want to make sure I got this right. I don't think, there's also another letter that I don't think I have here, but there's another letter that actually describes how they went back to the Coratoman estate there in Virginia and received 60, I'm gonna get this right, I'm getting my numbers right. It was 60, well, it was 69 in total. Because the 3 escaped on April 18th, 1814, and then they went back and got 66 others. And it turned out to be the largest number of Africans, enslaved Africans to really be freed during that war from one place, from one actual place. And the state of Virginia actually lost the most amount of slaves. And let me just show you, we're gonna go 2 slides down to, this is the muster of the Narcissus, His Majesty's ship, Narcissus, where the names, this might be difficult to see, but up in the top 3 letters there, names, are in fact Tom Saunders, Ezekiel Loney, and Kennedy Breton. And it says runaway slaves from the Chesapeake Bay. And those dates and times matched up to the actual letter describing the escape. Okay, and I think I did an enlargement of that here. One slide down, you can see the men's names. And then the rest was about taking my family to the actual places. And we created origami boats and put his number on, because his number was 44, and you could see combing through the various musters that he actually went through the ranks. So you see him going in as a enslaved person, and then he's a private, then he goes to corporal. When he actually is decommissioned, he is a sergeant. So we went to Tangier Island. We got a chance to, the mayor took us, I'm gonna move through somewhat quickly, but well, yeah, I did have Alan Taylor. That's a great book to read on the internal enemy.
This one.
Yeah, this one, yeah. So, and next one I'm going, I have to move really quickly because I know time is running out. I wanted to show a couple other things. Right, so that's the mayor of, and he still is the mayor of Tangier Island. Got his name momentarily. Alan Taylor is the Pulitzer Prize author of this book. I had a chance to meet him. That's another story. I'd love to tell the story, maybe in the exchange, where I have Tina Dunkley, descendant of British royalty. That was a joke that I did, and but as a result of putting that on my tag, I met this gentleman, and he told me that he knew who my ancestor was, which was, and I learned so much more from him. So then finally I go to Trinidad. Well, I'm in Trinidad. I'm really going back and forward to Trinidad. I met the US ambassador, Beatrice Welters, she was unaware of the descendants of African-Americans living in Trinidad in the southern part. So she became involved, and she engaged the US, the commissioners of the United Kingdom and Canada to produce a documentary, which is on YouTube, called The Americans. And then well, I didn't show this. This is really important because the descendants actually celebrate their the landing, the settlement, which is August 20th in 1815 and 1816. And then finally, I'm going to scroll on down. They had this particular event in 2016 for all the incredible leaders like Keela Jatamogi and Lisa Atwater. There was a lot of people from this community that were very active. And finally, I think I'm finally down to a couple of things here. This is the website from the Coratoman Estate from the Historic Christ Church Foundation, which is very active, a website. They as in the volunteer Patrick Heffernan has processed all of the enslaved people that they had on this plantation, and it's well over 12, I think it was like 1,200 from the 1700s, early 1700s, might even be 1600s, but early 1700s through the Civil War. And so this is that site, if you ever have a chance, go through it. But my ancestor, Ezekiel Loney, is first registered at the age of 2 years old in 1789. So he was there from at least 2, we know, and at 27 years old is when he ran off with the British. And there's a wonderful discussion for us to have about how that could have happened. And then finally, the last scenes, by the way, are, I'm just gonna come through because I know I'm over right now. This is the park, the National Park Service and Forestry Service of Florida at that site, the Negro Fort that Professor Kent here has just talked about. They actually had an event there this past summer, and we went there. People from the community went. They said prayers. They called on the ancestors because they are really doing quite a bit of work down there as well. I will close with that. That's the end of my story here. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Well, I'm going to try to put this into context of the larger world, but it's really hard to follow your axe, guys. There were 3 wars that really showed the change in the concept of slavery in the United States, or what is now the United States, and on a wider scheme on the world stage. And if we go back to the American Revolution and the War of 1812, as opposed to the Civil War, we are looking at two different contexts for slavery. Those who went and fought, and we have talked about this, Tina and I today, about the concept of, which is generally received, those people, about 5,000 Blacks fought for the Continental Army and for state militias in the American Revolution, but a lot more fought for the British. And it's often been said that in the American Revolution and in the War of 1812, those who fought, say, in the United States Navy, were fighting for patriotism, for their country, which is absolutely incorrect. They were fighting for their freedom, which was offered to them. They were instruments of the countries that they were fighting for or fighting with. The War of 1812 and the Revolution. In the Civil War, after 1862, it becomes a different animal. But I have to go back to the American Revolution to put this in context, because at the beginning of the war here in the Chesapeake Tidewater, the population of Virginia was about 40% Black. In Maryland, it was about 38%. That were slaves, something along those lines, which is a huge body of people. When you're talking about what was the population of Virginia, it was 220,000 Blacks of a population of 538,000. That's a massive population under the whip. In the War of 1812, it was a little different. About a third of the population of Virginia was Black, but it was a much larger population. Pretty much the same here in Maryland. So we end up with this context of population and the weight of that population. And throughout the duration of this time period, from the American Revolution to the Civil War, things have happened on a world stage. There is a war in France and between England and Napoleonic Wars. In Central and South America, there are revolutions. In Haiti, there is a Black revolution, the first Black independent move in the Western Hemisphere, and it terrorizes everybody in the white communities. At the outset of the American Revolution, there was very few forces in Virginia and almost nothing in Maryland representing the King's Army. And when the revolution begins in Virginia, the governor of Virginia, the Earl Lord Dunmore, has nobody to fall back on. And in the British Parliament at the time, they were talking about possibly utilizing the slave population and authorizing freedom to them, for them, if they fight for the crown. Well, Lord Dunmore he seizes upon this and does it. And the first British reinforcements, about 60 men come in, and he issues the equivalent of the Emancipation Proclamation. So anybody who fights for the crown will be given their freedom. Well, they had to escape from their owners first, which many of them did. And he forms a regimental group called the Ethiopian Regiment. And that Ethiopian Regiment they're the first Black people to fight in the American Revolution. Crispus Attucks, of course, was killed in the Boston Massacre, but this is the first organized military operations. The irony of this is that Lord Dunmore did not free his own slaves. They got kicked out of Virginia pretty quickly after the Battle of Great Bridge, and they came up here to Maryland, and they messed around and finally were eradicated out of the region. But it didn't end it in the revolution in Maryland. For the Eastern Shore, there was a great number of loyalists, and in Southern Maryland, loyalists who stayed with the Crown and raised troops. And one of the things that they did was they acknowledged the need for manpower, which was African Americans, Black black troops, former slaves. And in guerrilla operations, right here on the Patuxent River, guerrilla operations, maritime operations went up until 1782. War was effectively over in 1781 at Yorktown, but it continued here. One of the guerrillas, a fellow named Jonathan Robinson, he had an entirely black crew of, they came up here and they decimated Benedict and Lower Marlborough and other places, and then took off. Groups of blacks spread away from these men and became guerrillas in their own right. One of the fellows was named Captain George, or Captain, probably Isaiah George, who they called him a picaroon. And what they did was they raided any place they could, and eventually they became pirates after the British evacuated and gave up. They had nowhere else to go. And most of them were rounded up and executed. And pretty much the standard went until the War of 1812. But in between, in 1791 to 1805, the Haitian Revolution took place, and Toussaint Louverture wins, beating the French Empire. And the consequence of that here in the United States was absolute terror, particularly in the southern colonies of Maryland and Virginia. Because by this time, there is almost 250,000 slaves in Virginia. And by 1812, it was much less in Maryland, but it was still pretty predominant. So the fear of slave insurrection, the fear of starting an insurrection and overthrowing the white man was predominant. And all of a sudden, the laws came down even harsher on ownership of blacks and what should be done to them. Maryland adopted the Black Code. If you're a free man or a slave, you have to follow the code. You have to, if you're a free man, you have to own a house, because if you don't, you're considered indolent. You're considered a rabble rouser or a troublemaker. So all of this transpires in this short period of time, and then the war breaks out, and the British are faced with the same thing as we are here. The British invade the Chesapeake Bay in 1813, and it becomes a British lake. The Narcissus is one of the ships, one of the frigates that comes in and stays here for a couple of years. They develop a base on Tangier Island. On April 2nd of 1813, Admiral Alexander Cochrane, who is in charge of the American station, because of the manpower need, they can occupy the bay, but they can't carry the war to the shore. They fall upon the idea of freeing the slaves. And he issues on April 2nd that document that Tina just described so eloquently, inviting anybody to fight for the British and will receive territory in the British Empire. That's an invitation. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people join. They flow in. There's a system for them to be able to come to a certain island or place or some other and follow the light system to get to the British frigates. And they form the Black Colonial Corps, the Black Marines, who actually Admiral Sir George Cockburn, who is in charge of the Chesapeake, puts them into action right away. And they are trained on Tangier Island. And if you see the documentary, you're going to see what it looked like, the British base, because they're going to roll back the waters. And the consequence of this is that these people are the spear, they are the tip of the spear in every campaign in the Chesapeake, including the burning of the US Capitol and the White House. This is a big deal. And they are given land in Trinidad, Tobago, Trinidad, and Nova Scotia. Guess which one I'd pick? In Trinidad, there's 440 of the Colonial Corps who are given land, 16 acres apiece, 220 plots of land that are given in 6 towns. They're still called company villages, which is remarkable. I've been to Trinidad and Tobago, and I have met some of her ancestors. And we sat on the beach and talked about it, and I knew nothing about it until I talked to them. That was 40 years ago, but this is the thing, and Michael was talking about Charlie Ball.
Yeah.
Charles Ball went through this horrible thing, which he described so eloquently, and he actually ran away twice, got away the second time, but he was an old man by then. But Charlie Ball fought at the Battle of Bladensburg, standing right beside the Commodore that stood his ground, Commodore Joshua Barney. The black man was engaged in the US Navy. It was the only service that would take a black freeman, but they did serve in the Navy. The Civil War comes along a few years later, and the story changes again. This time, the South is totally dependent on black labor, and they're the labor force because they are the source of all of the treasury of the South, whether it's cotton or tobacco. And the North, the war begins, it's a war for the Union, but by 1862, it becomes a war to free the African-American, the slave, through the Emancipation Proclamation. Not because of the freeing of slaves, but because of the Union's need for manpower. There are so many people dying. Ultimately, 630,000 men will die on the battlefield, and another 200,000 will die from diseases and so forth. And then from corroborative long-term ailments, another 400,000. So the manpower needs are enormous. And when Lincoln finally issues the Emancipation Proclamation after the Battle of Antietam, the first major battle that the Union wins, and he sees an opportunity, it is able to add to the labor force for the Union Army. This is a big deal. This is huge. And here in Southern Maryland becomes the largest training base for the Union U.S. colored troops, as it was called at the time. The United States colored troops, Maryland fields 6 regiments. 4 regiments are trained at Camp Stanton at Benedict, Maryland, which is still there, an archaeological site. It's the largest base in the United States for African-American soldiers. 4 regiments come out beginning in March of 1864 to the end of the war. They fight in 32 major engagements and major skirmishes. They are fighting throughout the entirety of the South. And at the end of the war, they are the first to enter Richmond. By the end of the war, they leave as free men. They spent 25% of their manpower died in the war or from disease and so forth. 1/4 of that loss was down here at Benedict before they even left. This is the end. The whole story goes on, but my time is up.
Well, this one thing I wanted you to tell them about was Charles Ball being taken onto the ships during the War of 1812 to ask the runaways, the colonial Marines to return. You were the one that, wasn't Charles Ball brought onto a ship?
Yes.
When
Charles Ball.
Yeah.
Charles Ball was a crewman on board one of Commodore Joshua Barney's ships.
Right, but my understanding was that he was brought onto the ship, a British ship, along with some of the plantation owners to ask them to return.
At the beginning, yeah.
Yeah, to ask them to return.
Return the slaves.
Right, yeah, yeah. I think.
Yeah, I'm not certain that was Charles Ball, but.
Oh, okay.
I don't,
Oh,
I may be wrong, but I'm
Okay.
not certain it was him. But the idea here was that the owners in April of 1813
right.
are going on board Admiral Coburn's ship and said, will you please return our slaves? And Coburn goes to the slaves and said, any of you want to go back?
I think I read that in Jean's book, actually.
Yeah, James got it in his
Yeah,
book, right?
Well, thank you so much. I know I have a few questions, but I'd like to hear what questions are coming from the floor, from those of you who have heard this story, whether it's part of our history you already know, or whether it's new to you.
Yes. Hi, my name is Ron Clark. In light of the controversy created by Colin Kaepernick, football player, who kneeled football games, just with talent, national anthems. It appears that the author of the national President Scott Key actually encountered the film Marines. And I read here somewhere that he was like second lieutenant in the.
Could you speak up? I have a hard time.
He was a second lieutenant in the American Army, and he encountered the Marines at Battle of Gettysburg.
Mhm.
And it seems, it appears that that might have inspired him to write a third verse of the national anthem. And he reads
The controversial verse.
the controversy. And where is that band who so fondly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, and home and the country should leave us no more? Their blood has washed out in our foul footsteps of pollution. And his keep no refuge to save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight for the gloom of the grave. And the star spangled banner be triumphed darkly for the land of truth and home of freedom. And some saying that that verse pretty much is a counter with the Roman Gates, inspired him to write that because he was upset of the fact that these black soldiers were fighting against his at the time.
That's news to me. That's really interesting.
It makes perfectly good sense.
Yeah. Well, I would like to respond to that. Both Michael and I have got this from the Civil War, and I would like to read you a stanza from this. And it's from, I think, the 30th Regiment, isn't it? The song?
Yes, they look like men of war.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
The song is They Look Like Men of War, and it's the first regimental song for a black unit in the entire United States. And I'd just like to read you one of these stanzas. Hark, I listened to the trumpeters, they called for volunteers. Their horses white, their armor bright, with courage bold they stand. I set my heart quite in a flame, a soldier thus to be. They look like men, they look like men, they look like men of war, like me. And that's kind of the other side of it. And I would also like to read you what Douglas said at the recruitment of these, if I can find it here, at the recruitment, trying to get the federal government to recognize the black man as an adequate soldier. It's a remarkable piece. If I can find it. Well, I'll pass for the moment, but I've got it here.
I do recall a quote from Admiral Calvert, who you mentioned, describing the intensity, the discipline, and the ferocity
Right.
which the colonial Marines fought.
After the Battle of Pungateek, where they stood their ground and the Royal Marines backed off. And he said, there are no better fighting men.
Right.
And they were trained on Tangier Island. Their barracks are out there. I actually dove on, many of them are buried there too. And I dove on what may have been one of the grave sites because the islands have eroded. And Tangier Island is being recreated based upon the record that we found in Scotland, the actual plan of the island and the base on the island. And this is where these guys came from. This is where they were trained. And some of them never made it home or never made it to the West Indies. But it's a remarkable story.
And that plan was drawn by the third company, not the third company, battalion.
No, it was company, the third company.
Third,
Was it?
yeah, no, it was the third battalion.
Oh, yeah, the
Yeah,
third, you're right.
that the Colonial Marines that actually did that plan.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Have an idea of the number of enslaved Africans the British resettled?
And what?
That,
How many enslaved Africans did the British resettle? Like in
Trinidad and
Nova
Nova Scotia.
Yeah, Trinidad.
In Trinidad, I believe it was under 500.
I want to say, somehow 8 comes to mind,
I've
but
got
yeah.
I got the
Yeah,
stats here
Yeah, I
somewhere.
don't know. I'm not holding a lot of things,
Yeah.
but there were at least 4,000 that ran off. Most of whom were sent to Nova Scotia. But in terms of at the end of the war, the Colonial Marines from the Chesapeake Bay, for sure, the majority of them were sent to Trinidad. But there were also Colonial Marines that they recruited in the Gulf from New Orleans
Right,
and
right.
the like. And those people at the end of the war were actually sent to the Bahamas,
Mhm.
the Bahamas, Bermuda, and Trinidad. But for those the couple of hundred that decided to stay, they're the ones, I think they gave the number of 270.
I have it right
So,
here.
mhm.
I have it right here. They sent 6 companies, they were formed into company villages. A total of 411 men by disbandment time had increased by the time the units had disbanded at the end of the war. 575 men, 407 having families, including 83 women and 85 children. And when they arrived in Trinidad in August of 1816, they were housed in dormitories spread through 8 villages, 150 men in settlements at the time, and each ultimately allowed 16 acres on 220 plots. And these were divided up into one town called Guacara, Grande Mahambe, and then the others were Division A, Division B, Division C, and one was called Monkey Town. And these were in various sizes between 60 lots down to 28 lots. And that forms the crux of the towns, and they are still vestigially there.
Yes, they are
Which
very
is
much
really-
there, and would love to receive all of you as tourists. Oh, yeah, they're waiting.
They would love you. They
They
would
would
love to have
love
you.
you. I should also mention my niece, Karen Dunkley. She's come in.
Hi, Karen.
Ken Dunkley's daughter. She's here. And
And there actually would have been a lot more people to go if they understood what the British were saying. You know, you got a Southern black accent speaking to a Cockney accent. And so it was a lot, what? So they didn't understand what he was talking about.
And then we were talking, what Don and I were talking about is the fact that, well, they distributed, I think, 1,500 flyers, according to
Right.
Patrick, but he said that they also published in the
problem-
local papers, so.
It was the dumbest thing that the Virginians ever did, which was to take the flyers, the words on the flyers, and publish them in the newspapers. So all the newspapers go back to the slave owners. And the slave owners are all talking about it, and the slaves are picking it up. And all of a sudden, there's this, they call it a stampede, when a mass of people would leave the plantation en masse. This happened during the Civil War, when Washington was emancipated in 1862. The city was emancipated, and everybody that had a slave in Southern Maryland was crying the blues because their whole plantation was running off to Washington, thinking that they were going to be free if they got in the District of Columbia, which wasn't the case because the fugitive slave law was still active. That meant the slave owners could go into the district and bring their slaves back to Southern Maryland.
Yes,
Black soldiers who fought for the Union during the Civil War, did they receive benefits of pension or?
Yes, they did.
And so, do those rights taken away from them? They allow-
But they
They
were, I was
received their benefits.
gonna say they were entitled to it. Again, my father lived during that time. He was born in 1914. He recalls talking to some of those people, and the problem was that they would send them a notification saying, you're entitled to this, send us the postage, and then
Yeah,
they
it
just
costs
didn't have the
money.
money for it, to
Right.
get some of the medals and things they were entitled to. They didn't have the money to get it. And a lot of them-
Some people actually made long distance walks
Yes,
to get to a place where they could be recognized for that.
so a lot of them have actually passed away, and some of their wives later on the thirties or so, 1930s, 1940s, were able to get some of those benefits.
So the idea of the acres of rural, that extended to lots of.
It was, technically it was supposed to, but it didn't, particularly in southern Maryland, it did not.
It was mostly the Georgia, Florida area where that was offered by a general order. And so once the new president came in, Johnson, he rescinded all those general orders.
Right.
Well, if I may add, sort of bring us fast forward to World War II. My father did not receive, and many veterans, African-American veterans did not receive their benefits until they were too old to utilize them. So my father didn't get his until he was early 80s, 85 or something to that effect.
Really?
Oh, really? And there was something in the news about that. They would, so yeah, that's sort of a practice, but there was something I wanted to say.
You have a question?
Yeah, it's very interesting that you made reference to the fact that families were fled.
Right.
We've had an opportunity to research the enslaved from our church, Middleham and St. Peter's, Middleham Chapel in particular. And we've been able to get case studies through Chris Haley and the archives in the state of Maryland. And invariably, the stories are that the enslaved men would not leave without their
The family, right.
I didn't know whether you want to speak to that or reflect on that.
That became a big problem for the Royal Navy. There was no place to put the slaves except aboard ships. And there was a limited number of ships that the Royal Navy could provide for the blockade of the Chesapeake. They had a huge fleet here compared to us. They were 7 times our entire Navy, but it was still a small body of ships. So the ability for them to transport, number one, to house them and to feed them. At one point, the entire Royal Navy in the Chesapeake went on half rations. They didn't have enough food because they had so many refugees who were on board the ships. So that was an issue. I would add to that during the Civil War, when we started to receive the refugees who were, because of the Emancipation Proclamation, they are fleeing their homes and so forth, or their plantations and crossing over into Maryland. And in Southern Maryland, the Freedmen's Bureau creates the refugee farms along the Patuxent River, the 3 major farms, with hundreds and hundreds of people who are established in these farms, but they didn't have anything for them to subsist off of. They expected them to go out and farm, raise their own sustenance, but instead they just dumped them there. So finally, they ended up actually conducting raids into the northern neck of Virginia simply to require farming equipment, seed and so forth. But in the process of one raid alone, they freed 810 more slaves, which is 10% of the population of the northern neck. And they brought them here to Maryland. So it became an issue of supply and demand.
And I'd like to point out that in the case of the Coratoman estate, when my ancestor went back 4 days later with the British to get the 66 other people, it turns out that boat filled up. There was a line of them and they couldn't get them all on board.
Right.
So that meant that they were left That's something that's.
And
sort
you
of-
know what that meant.
Yeah. Though there is a story on record through the Underground Railroad, the person who documented the stories of a Loney, Cornelia Loney, who she might have been a little girl at the time, I don't know, but she, as a grown woman, apparently was with her mistress, the person that, her owner in Philadelphia. They made a trip to Philadelphia. And at that point, she decided to leave her. And they recorded that, and they were saying, well, why would you leave her? She's treating you well. She says, no, she sold all of my children. And so they made passage for her to Canada. We don't know what became of her, but it is documented. And it's Cornelia Loney.
There was a, yes, please.
Yeah, question, someone mentioned Johnson. And then Grant comes along, a huge send troops or south to actually protect the rights to go for that. What happened here? In Southern Maryland?
Southern Maryland, well, immediately after the war, Southern Maryland, number one, during the war, they established the training camp for the U.S. colored troops at Camp Stanton. And the recruitment, they had recruitment stations all up and down the Patuxent River, which Southern Marylanders, of course, we sent from Southern Maryland, from Maryland, we sent 22,000 men to fight for the Confederacy. 56,000 men in Maryland fought for the Union. I think that was the figure. But Southern Maryland was largely depopulated of a labor force because of the recruitment and because of the families fleeing to Washington or military bases. At the end of the war, Southern Maryland's labor force is down by about 8 to 10%, something like that, because they had left. Their men, the men who fought for the Confederacy, an awful lot of them were gone, and those who came home to the war had not been fought here, but it was desolate. The plantations were broken up. In St. Mary's County, on any given newspaper a week, you could see the ads, you can total them up, and you're looking at everything going into bankruptcy. It was total depression in Southern Maryland. The tobacco market dried up. Most of the manpower was old, but an awful lot of people came back. The slaves who had been freed but couldn't get away. There was no place for them to go. They had to go back to their former masters. And you will see a lot of the names today, both black and white, who share the same name, who had to go back to their masters and ask for a job. The institution of what was an artificial slavery, I guess you would call it, which was to hire your children out to a plantation guy for 7 years. This is like, during the colonial period, for 7 years so that they could learn a trade. But basically it was slave labor, and the mother and father would get an amount of money. This came before the Supreme Court. This became a big issue. And it was one of the issues that helped pass the 14th Amendment. And in Southern Maryland, it became illegal. But when the soldiers started coming home from the front, Southern Marylanders started coming home from the front. If you look at the newspapers of the day, you will see murders, you will see things that are really beatings and so forth. It was not a good place to be a black person. Here in Calvert County, the attempt to ambush the man who ran the farms after the war, he's still pulling things together, He's going up what is now Route 4. And they ambushed him. And he got away, but 4 of his guards, all black, were mutilated, killed. So that's what happened after the war.
So what I look at that time is the vote count. Abraham Lincoln received 1 vote.
One vote in
County, the second time around, he doubled it.
Right. And if you were what they call a black Republican, meaning a white man who voted for, you were tarred and feathered. And they drove you out of the county, and they did that.
I would like to point out, though, that there were some stories of triumph and success after the end of the Civil
Right.
War. There was a returning soldier who had, he was free actually when he enlisted. His name was Joseph H. Wallace, and he lived in the Parkers Creek area.
Oh, yeah.
And when he returned, he managed in the rest of his lifetime to accumulate over 300 acres of land, both north and south of Parkers Creek. There were also Hezekiah and Mason and his brother, who had been enslaved down at the Sheridan Point farm. But they had a business on the side where they ran a truck farm while they worked for the owners of Sheridan Point. After the war, when all these families that Don was talking about were leaving and going bankrupt, there were people like the brothers Mason who bought a farm here in Prince Frederick,
Right.
a couple hundred acres that had been foreclosed on. That land is where you see Mason Road. The last chunk of Mason property is now part of the Yardley Hills development, but there are still Mason descendants there. Same thing with the brothers Johnson. Albert Gant put the money together to buy tons of land, which is now in the hands mostly of his great grandsons who have a business. Mutual Elementary School was built on their land. Plus, they still have a bunch. So there, and those aren't just isolated stories. Joe Harris Road is named for Josephus Harris. The oldest son in every in that family since before the Civil War is named Josephus. But that land again was bought after the white landowners were foreclosed on for lack of bound labor. And the descendants of Josephus Harris still live on that road. So there are stories in the landscape still around us. If you know what you're looking at, you can.
There are the expatriates who left the county. An awful lot of them went to Baltimore, and some of them went on to become merchants, become very successful. The founder of the Afro-American newspaper was, I believe, in the 19th Regiment. Is that right?
Not sure about that.
Okay, well, he was in one of the regiments trained at Camp Stanton. So the migration to a city center, which was already a center for free blacks before the war, in Calvert, in Maryland before the Civil War, there were 33,000 free blacks. 25,000 of them were in Baltimore. And Baltimore was a center for immigration, 120,000 a year, something like that. Enormous immigration from Europe. So it was an industrial center, third most important in the United States at the time. But here in Southern Maryland, because of the war, there was that period of depression, which, as Kirsty says, so effectively was utilized by Black population.
We had, excuse me, I thought we had another question back there. Purple. In the back row?
Doesn't seem so. I have a,
Lauren.
here she is. Yeah.
My name is Lauren. I have a question. I used to work at Rhode Island National Seashore, and I was wondering about your experiences working with the National Park Service during your research during the continuation side of.
Down in Florida?
Yes.
Okay, well, it's interesting that, I'm glad you said you were from Cumberland Island because, there were freedom seekers from Cumberland Island. And I was about to say, well, now I'll answer your question first. Excellent in terms of, I'm trying to pull up my names of the two wonderful people that, I can tell you after, it's gonna take me a moment. The National Park Service person and the person over the forestry. Great, because there was a memorandum of understanding that was negotiated between that service and the American Foundation in Trinidad. So that's, you know, and they're moving ahead to really treat that area in commemoration of the people who were, you know, killed on site. But there was something else I was about to say about these maroons. The reason why that my understanding, the British set up that fort in the Gulf was because there was already a maroon community that had been established there for several generations based on its location. And bringing that forward right now, among several scholars here in the States and in the Caribbean, there is a movement and a publication coming forward about the maroonage in the Afro-Atlantic. So from Jamaica, the Maroons in Jamaica, the Maroons in the Garifunas, in Central America, Suriname, and the Americans, they've really connected in a way in this period of time with the UN movement toward recognition of people of African descent. So yeah, there's quite a bit going on right now about that. So thank you for that question. And some of those people are the runaways from Cumberland Island are documented in John Weiss's book. So yeah.
Chris Banks in back row.
Thank you so much. Share some of it's new for us sometimes, but it's a lot of it's new because even though I work with this global society, still there's always.
That's right.
Maybe my question. So when it came to we talk about after the Civil War, how especially in Southern Europe, really they don't always hold it. Really have a difference because they have no power. Now, I think I understood from celebrating Lower Marlboro Freedom Day here in Calvert that a lot of people, with white farmers who lost slaves, you know, to the British for the war, well, they were able to get some of their able to reimbursed for their loss. That was everything.
Yes, are you talking about the bounty? Do you want to speak to that, Don?
I didn't quite catch the question.
Okay, the white farmers who lost they had to
Yeah,
spend
I know where you're going. Okay.
Okay,
Yes, the war claims for property lost was brought before a special commission of the Congress, which was in operation until the Civil War. The Maycall family, for instance, down here, had a lawsuit, had a suit for compensation of the loss of their slaves and the burning of their properties by the British because an Calvert County militia occupied it, and that thus made it a target for the British. So they declared because of that they were justifiably due for compensation for their losses. And the losses included property, and of course, slaves were property, chattel property. So the consequence of that was that awful lot of people didn't get paid. Congress was always short in paying off its debts. Not that that's anything new, but they awful lot of people didn't get their money. And the United States, the American State Papers, which are these giant elephant-sized volumes. You can see them in the Library of Congress and a number of other repositories. They're about that thick, little teeny type. And one whole volume is nothing but the claims for, what has to be paid back. But it's a wonderful account because in all of these entries, they're talking about what is lost, the events that occurred. And from that, when I was writing about the War of 1812 here in the Chesapeake, it was a wonderful thing about what was happening on the Patuxent River through the claims. But human bodies, slaves, are part of the property.
If I could interrupt, her question was actually about remuneration for the Civil War.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought.
At the bounty records. By the way, those cases he's talking about are available. Anybody can find them on the Maryland State Archive,
Right.
the Legacy of Slavery in Maryland website.
And I just wanted to add that my ancestors, the owners of my ancestors were reimbursed. Their names appear, Ezekiel Oney, Thompson, they appear on those documents up in College Park, Maryland, Nara. So they did get reimbursed.
And you'll see them on the documentary.
Right.
Yeah, so the bounty for the Civil War for each of these soldiers that enlisted that had been enslaved was, in short, to save time, $300 per man.
Right. That
For
was not
men who
always
were
honored.
free, like Joseph H. Wallace, who was free inside and enlisted, he received, owing to an act of Congress, free men who enlisted, they collected the $300 bounty.
The bounty was also paid to the owners, but at the end, the recruitment, the bounty was not paid, even though, and a number of them sued the federal government afterwards for reimbursement. And there are a number of lawsuits in the District of Columbia for that very thing.
Other questions?
So can we move into gathering other ideas or shall I? Or do you?
You go right ahead.
All right, so I was interested in, thank you all for coming and thank you for an amazing panel, and they will have some input into this next piece. I will stop recording in a second, but I'm curious to know what else you want to learn about local African-American history. And also, as a secondary question, what are the resources out there now for us to learn about local African-American history? Because I know if you're here, you're interested. And you may already know that just for the front row are working on a project that they'll share. So I'm gonna share a piece of technical thing where you can actually go on your phone to a website if you have your phone, and put in a code, and then you can actually add to that, and we'll see it on the screen, or you can just say it out loud, and I'll try to capture it as you type. So the question is, what else do you want to learn more about? So I'm gonna pull that up and share the screen too. Stop recording first.